Victor stood at the mouth of the alley, his polished Italian leather shoes sinking into a carpet of rotting debris and shattered glass. The stench of stagnant water and industrial waste clawed at his throat, a violent contrast to the sterile, cedar-scented air of his high-rise office. He looked absurd, a predator in a $5,000 suit standing amidst the ruins of the forgotten city. But he didn't care about the grime. His obsidian eyes were fixed on the flickering light of a third-floor window across the courtyard. He had tracked Eliza through the labyrinthine streets, watching her small, weary frame navigate shadows that would make his most hardened soldiers hesitate. As she paused to adjust the heavy bag pulling at her pregnant form, a single tear tracked through the dust on her cheek. Victor felt a strange, terrifying tremor in his chest. The cold machine of his heart was finally beginning to glitch. In the vaulted silence of the Hale mansion, Victor moved like a shadow through a mausoleum of his own making. The vast corridors, lined with cold marble and priceless art, felt less like a home and more like a museum dedicated to a life that had ended 4 years ago. His daily routine was a masterclass in clinical precision, a silent breakfast at a table meant for 12 hours of low-pitched calls that decided the fates of thousands, and a glass of amber scotch as the sun dipped below the Chicago skyline. He treated his staff with the same detached efficiency as the software in his boardroom, never looking them in the eye, never learning their stories. To Victor, Eliza Moore was merely the ghost who kept the silver polished and the dust from settling on Elena's piano, until the morning the stillness finally broke. He had been standing in the library, his back turned as he stared out at the gray morning fog, when the rhythmic sound of a brush stopped abruptly. He turned, ready to issue a sharp reprimand for the lapse in discipline, but the words died in his throat. Eliza was slumped against the mahogany bookshelf, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. For the first time in years, Victor actually looked at her. He saw the dark circles bruising the skin beneath her eyes and the way her small hands clutched at the apron of her light blue uniform. But it was the curve beneath that apron that caused the air to leave his lungs. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. She was pregnant, and she was terrified. As their eyes met, Eliza let out a small, strangled gasp, instinctively pulling her arms over her midsection as if to shield her secret from his cold gaze. In that moment of silent confrontation, the carefully constructed ice around Victor's heart developed its first hairline fracture. He didn't offer comfort, he didn't know how, but as she hurried out of the room in a flurry of muffled apologies, he felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in years, an obsessive, driving curiosity that no ledger or contract could ever satisfy. The cruel boss was no longer just watching a servant, he was watching a mystery that refused to stay buried. The clock on the dashboard of the black Bentley flickered to 12:14 a.m., the pale light reflecting in Victor's narrowed eyes. He sat in the shadows of the mansion's long driveway, the engine idling with a low, predatory hum. Ahead, the iron gates groaned open to let a lone figure pass. Eliza was wrapped in a thin, worn cardigan that offered little protection against the biting Chicago wind, her head bowed as she trudged toward the distant bus stop. Victor waited, his gloved hands tightening on the steering wheel. He could have ordered a dozen men to track her, but a primal, possessive instinct demanded he see the truth for himself. When the rusted city bus finally screeched to a halt, Eliza climbed the steps with a heavy, labored grace. Victor followed at a distance, his luxury sedan a dark shark gliding through the murky waters of the city's industrial district. As the miles clicked away, the glittering skyscrapers of the loop vanished, replaced by the jagged silhouettes of boarded-up warehouses and flickering neon signs of liquor stores. The air outside grew thick with the scent of wet asphalt and neglect. This was the Bottoms, the city's darkest corner, a place where the police only went in armored convoys and where Victor's own soldiers conducted their most ruthless business. The bus hissed to a final stop under a broken streetlight that buzzed like a dying insect. When Eliza stepped off, she looked smaller than ever, her silhouette swallowed by the oppressive gloom of the tenements. Victor killed his headlights, allowing the darkness to claim him. He watched her navigate the cracked pavement, her hand instinctively resting on her swollen abdomen as she glanced nervously over her shoulder. Every instinct in Victor's body screamed that this was a trap or a betrayal, yet as he stepped out of his car, the biting cold hitting his face, he felt a strange, hollow ache. He moved with the practiced silence of a hunter, keeping to the deep shadows of the brick alleyways. He was a king entering a graveyard, his expensive wool coat brushing against walls covered in grime and graffiti. Ahead of him, Eliza disappeared into a doorway that hung precariously off its hinges. The cruel boss paused at the threshold of the crumbling building, the weight of the silence around him heavier than any debt he had ever collected. He wasn't just following a maid anymore, he was stepping into a world he had helped create but never cared to acknowledge, and the air here tasted of a desperation he was beginning to realize he shared. The interior of the tenement was a vertical nightmare of peeling lead paint and the heavy, humid scent of poverty. Victor stepped over a discarded syringe, his hand hovering near the concealed holster at his hip, his eyes scanning the flickering shadows of the stairwell. Each floor he climbed was a new assault on his senses, the muffled sound of a domestic dispute behind a thin wall, the skittering of rats in the vents, and the pervasive chill of a building whose furnace had died a decade ago. It was a world of sharp edges and broken promises, a place where life was cheap and hope was a luxury no one could afford. A surge of visceral disgust rose in his throat, but it was quickly eclipsed by a cold, sharp blade of anxiety. How many nights had Eliza walked these gauntlets alone? How many times had she climbed these treacherous, lightless stairs while carrying a child? The thought of her, fragile, quiet Eliza, existing in this decay while he sat in a mansion of gold and glass made his blood simmer with a new kind of rage. It wasn't the clinical anger he felt toward a business rival, it was a protective, territorial fire that shocked him with its intensity. He reached the third floor, where the hallway narrowed and the ceiling sagged under the weight of water damage. At the very end of the corridor, he saw her. She was fumbling with a ring of keys, her shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear into the shadows of the doorframe. The dim, yellow light of a single bulb overhead cast long, distorted shadows across her face, highlighting the exhaustion that seemed to bone deep. Victor stayed back, pressing himself into the darkness of a recessed doorway. He watched as she finally got the lock to turn, her hand resting protectively on her stomach as she stepped inside. For a moment, the door remained ajar, and a sliver of light spilled into the hallway. In that brief window, Victor didn't see a betrayal or a secret lover. He saw a room filled with mismatched furniture and a stack of second-hand baby clothes on a small table. The cruel boss felt the air leave his lungs. This wasn't a hiding place for a traitor, it was a fortress built on desperation. As the door clicked shut, leaving him in the suffocating dark, Victor realized that the woman he had treated like a ghost was the only person in his world who was truly fighting for something. And for the first time in his life, the man who owned half the city felt utterly powerless. Victor pressed his back against the cold, damp hallway wall, his heart hammering a rhythm that felt entirely foreign to him. The cruel boss of Chicago was reduced to a common eavesdropper, standing in a dim corridor that smelled of cabbage and old wood. He held his breath, the silence of the hallway so heavy it felt physical. Then, it happened. A sound pierced through the thin, scarred wood of the door, a high, melodic peal of laughter. It wasn't Eliza's weary sigh or the strained voice of a woman in hiding, it was the pure, unbridled sound of a child. The sound sent a jolt through Victor's spine, more shocking than any gunshot he had ever heard. He leaned closer, his temple resting against the peeling paint of the doorframe. Through the cracks in the wood, he heard a small, high-pitched voice. "Look, Mommy. The knight is winning. He's very brave, just like you," Eliza's voice replied, her tone transformed. The flat, robotic cadence she used at the mansion was gone, replaced by a warmth so thick it seemed to pulse through the wall. "But the knight needs to rest now, little one. It's late." "But I want to wait for the king," the boy insisted, followed by the soft thud of footsteps running across a hardwood floor. Victor's knees went weak, a sensation he hadn't felt since the day Elena was lowered into the ground. A king. The boy was waiting for a king. A cold sweat broke out across Victor's brow as the math of his past began to collide with the reality of the present. For years since that one blurred night of shared grief and whiskey in the library, a night he had buried under mountains of work and coldness. He had assumed his silence was shared, but as he listened to the child describe the dragon the knight had to slay, Victor realized he had been the monster in the story all along. The air in the hallway grew thin. He reached for the handle, his fingers trembling, a weakness that would have been a death sentence in his world. He wasn't thinking about security risks or betrayals anymore. He was thinking about the 4 years of laughter he had missed, the 4 years this boy had spent in a building that was rotting around him, while Victor sat in a fortress of gold. He didn't just want the truth, he needed to see the face that belonged to that laughter. With a slow, deliberate movement, he turned the knob. The door wasn't locked. Eliza had likely felt the slum's shadows were protection enough. As the hinges gave a low, mournful groan, the laughter inside stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that screamed louder than any cry. Victor stepped into the light, and for the first time in his life, the most powerful man in the city felt completely small. The heavy door yielded with a groan that sounded like a verdict. Victor stepped into the cramped living area, his presence instantly consuming the small, oxygen-starved room. The space was a patchwork of survival, a sagging sofa covered in a faded blanket, a small table with a single mismatched chair, and walls that wept with the dampness of the slum. But all the decay in the world couldn't distract him from the boy standing in the center of the room. The child couldn't have been more than 4. He was dressed in a threadbare t-shirt and oversized pajama pants, clutching a plastic knight whose shield had long ago snapped off. As Victor moved closer, the boy tilted his head, a sharp, inquisitive gesture that was a perfect mirror of Victor's own habit during a negotiation. Then, the boy looked up. Victor felt the world tilt on its axis. The child didn't have Eliza's soft, honey-colored eyes, he had the Hale eyes. They were a piercing, obsidian gray, framed by a thick, commanding brow and a gaze so intense it seemed to see right through Victor's expensive armor. The boy's dark hair was a messy crown, identical to the texture of Victor's own, and his chin carried the same stubborn, cleft line that had been a trait of the Hale men for 3 generations. "Mommy," the boy whispered, his voice small but steady. "Is this the king from the story?" Eliza let out a strangled cry, her hands flying to her mouth as she rushed to pull the child into the hollow of her side. She looked at Victor with the raw, wide-eyed terror of a cornered animal, her body trembling so violently the movement was visible through her thin cardigan. She was a mother protecting her cub from a predator she knew she couldn't defeat. Victor didn't move. He couldn't. The cruel boss, who had stared down federal prosecutors and rival kings, felt his knees finally betray him. He stood paralyzed, his eyes locked on the miniature version of himself standing in a room that cost less than the watch on his wrist. This was his blood. This was the heir to an empire worth hundreds of millions, and he was standing in rags, breathing in the mold of a forgotten tenement. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the boy's soft breathing and the distant, mocking sound of a siren outside. Victor's throat tightened, a lump of cold, hard grief and sudden, agonizing realization rising within him. He had come here looking for a traitor, but he had found his soul, abandoned in the dark, waiting for a father who had been too dead inside to look. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of years, broken only by the boy's soft, rhythmic breathing as he clung to Eliza's legs. Victor's presence, so sharp and imposing in his dark suit, seemed to bleed into the shadows of the room. He found his voice, though it sounded like it was coming from deep underwater. "How," was all he could manage. Eliza's eyes, bright with unshed tears, finally met his. She didn't look away this time. The terror was still there, but beneath it was a steel-hard resolve. "Do you remember the night before the 2nd anniversary of her passing?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You were drowning in the bottom of a bottle, calling out Elena's name in the library. I went to help you, to get you to bed, and you held me. You didn't even see me, Victor. You saw her." Victor felt a cold shiver trace his spine. He remembered the grief, the black, suffocating hole of that night, but the details had been lost to the haze of alcohol. "I found out a month later," Eliza continued, her hand smoothing the boy's dark hair. "I was going to leave, to disappear. But then, the doctors told us Elena's heart was failing faster than expected. She called me to her bedside. She knew, Victor. Somehow, she knew. Victor's heart skipped. She knew about the child. She saw the way I looked at her, the way I was getting sick in the mornings, Eliza said, a sob finally breaking through. She grabbed my hand, she was so weak, and she made me swear. She told me that if you knew, the guilt of your betrayal would kill you before the grief did. She said you weren't ready to be a father, that you would only see the boy as a reminder of your mistake. She made me promise to stay quiet until you were whole again. Eliza looked around the decaying room, at the water-stained ceiling and the meager pile of toys. She wanted you to have peace, even if it meant I had to live in the storm. I promised her, Victor. I promised the woman who gave me a job and a life that I would never burden you with the truth of that night. I've spent 4 years honoring a dead woman's wish while my son grew up in a place where the heaters don't work. The cruel boss felt the last of his defenses shatter. The woman he had loved had spent her final breaths protecting his conscience, while the woman who truly served him had sacrificed everything to keep that promise. He looked at the boy, his son, who was watching him with wide, obsidian eyes, waiting for the king to speak. Victor realized with a crushing clarity that he hadn't been protected by their silence, he had been exiled by it. He was a man with millions in the bank, yet he was the poorest soul in the room. Victor stood in the center of the cramped room, the air thick with the smell of damp cardboard and the faint, metallic tang of poverty. He looked down at his hands, the hands that signed billion-dollar mergers and ordered the dismantling of rival cartels, and for the first time, they felt heavy with the weight of useless gold. Outside the window, a siren wailed through the bottoms, a stark reminder of the violence and neglect he had safely ignored from his ivory tower. His empire, his vast warehouses, his fleets of black cars, it all felt like ash in his mouth. He looked at the small bowl on the table, containing nothing but a few dry crackers and a half-eaten apple. His son, his own flesh and blood, a Hale, had been going to sleep hungry in a building where the walls wept with mold, while Victor had been obsessing over the temperature of his vintage wine. The cruel boss felt a violent, internal collapse. The armor of his grief, the cold steel he had wrapped around his soul to survive Elena's death, didn't just crack, it disintegrated. He had spent 4 years calling himself a success, building a monument of power to bury his pain, yet he had failed the only duty that truly mattered. He had allowed his heir to become a ghost in the slums. He saw the way the boy's ribs showed slightly through his thin shirt as he clung to Eliza, and a sob, jagged and raw, tore through Victor's chest. It was a sound that had no place in a boardroom or a Mafia safe house. It was the sound of a man realizing he had been ruling a kingdom of nothing. I have spent millions on stones and steel, Victor whispered, his voice cracking as he slumped against the doorframe, his knees finally giving way. The most powerful man in Chicago was on the floor of a tenement, his head in his hands. I built a fortress to keep the world out, but all I did was lock myself in while my son starved in the dark. He looked up at Eliza, his eyes red-rimmed and pleading. The hierarchy of master and servant had vanished. In this rotting room, she was the one with the strength, the one who had carried the world on her shoulders while he had simply given up on living. The realization made him weak, but in that weakness, new, terrifying clarity was born. His empire wasn't his business, it was this boy. And he would burn the rest of the city to the ground before he let his son spend another hour in the cold. The stillness of the room was shattered by the rhythmic thunder of heavy boots echoing in the stairwell. Eliza pulled the boy closer, her eyes darting to the door in a flash of old terrors, but Victor stood up, his hand raised in a silent, calming command. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his voice no longer cold, but vibrating with an unstoppable authority. "Third floor. Now. And bring the medical unit." Minutes later, the cramped hallway was filled with men in dark tactical gear, the same men who usually cleared paths for Victor's violent acquisitions. But as they filed into the small apartment, there were no weapons drawn. Instead, they moved with a hushed, reverent efficiency. Victor's head of security, a man who had survived a dozen street wars, stopped dead when he saw the boy. He looked at the child's gray eyes, then at Victor, and gave a solemn, knowing nod. "Pack only what matters," Victor said, his voice low as he stepped toward Eliza. He reached out, his fingers hovering tentatively near the boy's shoulder before he found the courage to touch him. "The rest of this place, the cold, the hunger, it ends tonight. I am taking you home." The neighbors watched from behind cracked doors, their eyes wide as the most expensive fleet of SUVs the Bottoms had ever seen lined the trash-strewn street. In a neighborhood where sirens usually meant tragedy, the sight of Victor Hale personally carrying the small boy wrapped in his own cashmere coat was a silent miracle. The child clung to Victor's neck, his small hands marveling at the soft wool, while Eliza walked beside them, supported by two guards who treated her like a queen. As they stepped into the back of the armored Bentley, the interior glowing with warm ambient light, the boy pressed his face against the glass. He watched the shadows of the tenements recede into the distance. For Victor, the drive back was no longer a retreat into a lonely fortress. As the gates of the mansion groaned open, bathed in the golden glow of the estate's lights, he realized the house was no longer a mausoleum for Elena. It was finally a home. He looked at Eliza, whose head was resting against the leather seat in sheer exhaustion, and at his son, safe in his arms. The great relocation was more than a change of address, it was the moment the Hale legacy was pulled from the ashes of the slums and given a second chance to breathe. The heavy, mournful silence that had defined the Hale mansion for years was finally broken, replaced by the bright, chaotic sounds of a life reborn. In the emerald expanse of the back gardens, the boy, Leo, ran through the sunlight, his laughter echoing against the stone walls that had once felt like a prison. He no longer wore rags, he moved with the unburdened energy of a child who knew he was home, a miniature king reclaiming his kingdom. Watching him from the terrace, Victor felt a warmth in his chest that no amount of scotch or success could ever replicate. The cruel boss was gone, replaced by a man who looked at the world and finally saw color. Their wedding was not a cold corporate affair, but a quiet, sacred promise made under the shade of the ancient oaks Elena had once loved. Eliza stood beside him, radiant in ivory, her strength no longer hidden behind a maid's apron but worn openly as the matriarch of the house. As they exchanged rings, Victor didn't just see a wife, he saw the woman who had saved his soul by holding on to his legacy when he was too broken to carry it himself. They were no longer master and servant, but two survivors who had found a bridge across a sea of grief. But Victor's redemption didn't stop at the mansion gates. The guilt of the Bottoms still burned in his mind, driving him to transform his power into a shield for others. He established the Hale Family Foundation, a massive initiative that poured millions into the very slums he had once followed Eliza through. They built modern housing where the tenements had rotted, opened clinics for expectant mothers, and created a sanctuary for children who, like Leo, were waiting for a miracle. Every month, Victor returned to those streets, not in a darkened sedan to spy, but in the light of day to build. He stood in the same alleys where he had once felt weak, now standing tall as a man of purpose. He realized that his true empire wasn't measured by the height of his skyscrapers, but by the safety of the families he now protected. As the sun set over Chicago, casting a golden glow over his wife, his son, and his new mission, Victor Hale finally understood the secret that had frozen him that night in the slums: power is hollow until it is used to love. The legacy was no longer a burden of the past, it was a living, breathing promise for the future.